Welcome back to episode 5 of the O&O show. On deck for this episode, we of course have our weekly news, a new Superlative series. It's going to be Spring Chickens. We'll get more into what that means when we get to the Superlative series segment. And last but not least, we'll have another season preview. If you follow us on Twitter at O&O Sports, or if you saw the thumbnail, you know who it is. But nonetheless, we'll wait to get into that when we get there. Up first in our weekly news, we've got some big transfer portal moves. Jason Zandamela transfers from USC to Florida. He was the number 1 interior offensive lineman in the 2024 class, according to 24/7 Sports. 6'3", 285. He's a big guy. He was enrolled at USC in January, and he just transferred to Florida in the spring window. And that's big for Florida, getting a guy like that, kind of strengthening, bolstering the depth of that offensive line. One that wasn't terrible last year, but also wasn't very great. And we'll have to wait and see how much of an impact he can make in year 1 there at Florida. Next, we have Penny Boone. Originally at Toledo, transferred to Louisville earlier in the offseason and went back in the transfer portal in the spring window, and now he's at UCF. He's really just a workhorse running back. UCF is getting a monster guy there. In the group of 5, he was number 3 in rushing yards with 1,400 last season, number 3 in rushing touchdowns with 15, and number 1 in yards per carry with 7.2. Just monster numbers there at Toledo last season. And honestly, he was one of the bigger gets for Jeff Brom there at Louisville. And unfortunately, he didn't stay there. If you're a Louisville fan or if you're Jeff Brom, he goes over to work under Gus Malzahn at UCF. And honestly, not a bad choice. He should be able to start probably immediately, most likely immediately at UCF. And he's going to be a guy you really need to watch out for. Could easily lead the Big 12 in rushing yards. I say easily. The Big 12 has great running backs, but he's just that talented of a player. And after that, King Mack of Penn State transfers to Alabama. He was the number 6 safety in the 2023 class. And then once he entered the portal, he was the number 4 overall safety in the 2024 transfer class. He played in 2 games at Penn State in 2023, didn't log very many stats there, but he was a highly sought-after recruit in 2023. He should be able to add some secondary depth for Alabama, and they need it. They lost Caleb Downs. Obviously, he goes to Ohio State. King Mack obviously hasn't reached the level of a Caleb Downs, but he is very talented. He could reach a new level if he were to get playing time. He's very talented, very athletic. So he is a big name to watch there at Alabama. Up next in the news, we're actually going to talk about EA Sports College Football 25. Now, if you're a fan of college football, if you're a fan of sports video games, you have been all over this story. EA Sports is dropping a new college football game, the first one in over 11 years, I believe. And it is the most anticipated sports game probably ever. We're supposed to be getting more news on it in the coming weeks. The deluxe edition cover came out for the game. Featured on that cover was Michigan running back Donovan Edwards, Texas quarterback Quinn Ewers, Colorado defensive back / wide receiver Travis Hunter, new Ohio State running back Quinshon Judkins, formerly of Ole Miss, Georgia quarterback Carson Beck, and Alabama quarterback Jalen Milroe. Now, EA actually announced that more cover athletes are set to be released in about a week or so, and a countdown is actually featured on EA's website, set for the 16th of May at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. People are thinking this is a full reveal of the game with a set release date. It could be just the release of the new cover athletes, but either way, fans are excited. I'm excited. I know for a fact I'm excited. I've been waiting for this for a very long time, as many others have as well. So if you're like me and you're ready for this game to come out, I would say go to that EA Sports Twitter, turn those notifications on, and wait for the 16th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And up next in the weekly news, a former MLB player for the Marlins and Angels, Monty Harrison, is walking on at Arkansas. He is 28 years old. He spent, I believe, 6 or 7 years in the MLB, mostly in the minor leagues. He was drafted in the second round of the 2014 MLB draft by the Brewers after he committed to play football at Nebraska. He chose to forego his football career at Nebraska and was drafted into the MLB and stayed there up until now. He had limited experience in the major league level through 2020 to about 2022. And coming out of high school, he was touted as a very skilled athlete. I believe he's probably going to be a defensive back or a wide receiver. And for Arkansas, that's a pretty big deal. They haven't really had a great wide receiver threat in a few years. And who better than a former MLB player? Of course, he will walk on. He's not a scholarship player. But if I had to assume, he'll probably make the roster. Like I said, he was very touted at a high school. Obviously had a okay MLB career. Most players that are drafted don't even see the major league level. So the fact that he did proves that he is at least a decent athlete. And it's going to be interesting to track his progress at Arkansas through the summer. I believe a guy like that, of course, he's fully developed physically. He's 28. So he's going to be further along than a lot of the younger guys that they brought in. And he should be able to make an instant impact there if I had to assume. So shout out to Monty Harrison. Now for our next segment, it is the return of the Superlative series. We're talking about spring chickens. Now, if you will hear me out for a second, allow me to explain what a spring chicken is. These are going to be players that either flew under the radar going into this offseason or are new to their teams in general that have made a big impact throughout the spring for their teams and are looking like very good pickups thus far. And without further ado, our first player on the list for spring chickens is USC quarterback Jaden Maivia, formerly of UNLV. He transferred to USC in January. He was originally projected as the backup to USC quarterback Miller Moss, who backed up Caleb Williams last year. Now, the reason Moss was projected to be the starting quarterback over Maivia was, of course, that Holiday Bowl against Louisville. In that game, Moss went 70% with 372 yards, 6 touchdowns, and only 1 interception with a 98.1 QBR. And that really just impressed everybody. Before Maivia even transferred, it was pretty set in stone that Moss was going to be Lincoln Riley's next guy. But Maivia did end up transferring in from UNLV, like I said. And in the spring game, he outshined Moss. He went 15 of 17 with 172 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception compared to Moss's 16 of 21, 133 yards, 1 touchdown, and 2 interceptions. Moss didn't look great in that game. Maivia looked like the much more stable quarterback there. And it should make for a very good quarterback battle going into the summer and fall. I would highly recommend keeping an eye out on that to see what Lincoln Riley says regarding both of the QBs. If this spring has been any indicator, I would say Maivia has the edge right now. Moss, of course, is still extremely talented. He has just lacked a little bit of consistency in the spring. But like I said, if we follow through the summer, all of our questions should be answered. Lincoln Riley is a known quarterback guy, and he should have his guy by the fall. Up next, we have Clemson wide receiver Bryant Wesco. He has flown very under the radar at Clemson. He was the number 11 wide receiver from the 2023 class. And in the spring game, he had 3 receptions for 26 yards and a touchdown. Now, you might be thinking, well, Colton, those stats don't really jump off the sheet. They don't move me. And the biggest thing for Wesco is he made a great catch in the red zone for that touchdown that he recorded. And he proved he can be a very reliable red zone guy, which, if you know anything about Clemson, hasn't been something they've struggled to develop in recent years. And wide receivers in general have struggled to develop at Clemson in recent years since 2020, I believe, when Amari Rodgers was there. And Wesco originally was projected to be way down the depth chart. He is coming in as a redshirt freshman, and it wasn't expected that he was going to see a lot of real playing time. But seeing as he's kind of separated himself as a credible red zone threat for the Tigers, it seems to me like he could move his way up the depth chart, probably get some meaningful playing time in the fall. Clemson does have a few decent wide receivers in Tyler Brown and company. But one thing for Garrett Riley's offense is they usually have a deep wide receiver room. A lot of guys get targets. And if Wesco can prove that he is a credible red zone threat throughout the rest of the spring and summer, I find it very hard to believe that he couldn't see real playing time in 2024. Now, obviously, we'll have to wait and see on that. But with our next player, we don't have to wait and see. It's Nebraska quarterback Dylan Raiola. Now, Raiola was the number 2 quarterback in 2024 class, And in case you missed it, for those who are living under rocks, he flipped from Georgia to Nebraska late in the 2024 recruiting cycle. And if you know anything about Nebraska, you know how terrible that quarterback room was in 2023. And he's already being projected as Nebraska's first string quarterback. And prior to the spring, there were a few publications, there were a few what I would call Twitter trolls that said Dylan Raiola was overrated. He moved a lot in high school, he never stuck around in a place. He got this sort of unwarranted reputation as a competition dodger, but in the spring game of 2024, he proved everybody wrong, or I guess not everybody, just those select few, tiny few people, as he went 16 of 22 for 239 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 interception. Now, by themselves, those stats don't sound that impressive, but when you factor in the fact that he was splitting playing time with 3 other quarterbacks, it makes it a whole lot crazier to think about. And he actually received a lot of national attention on his 64-yard touchdown pass to wide receiver Jalen Lloyd. And most sane Nebraska fans across the country have to be foaming at the mouth watching that, considering they haven't really had a great quarterback since 2016, maybe earlier. So to see that, to see him hit a guy in stride for a bomb of a touchdown pass, it has to be getting the blood pumping for Nebraska fans. And for Raiola, he's just confirmed what we've already known, and that he's ready for fall ball. He's ready to suit up as the quarterback for Nebraska. They did have some other quarterbacks play in the spring game that didn't do terrible, but if I had to assume, there's not really going to be a battle there. Raiola should easily be the quarterback 1 at Nebraska come week 1. And for our last segment of this episode of the Ono Show, we're doing a season preview. Last week it was Florida State. This week it is the Texas Longhorns. Now, if you saw the SEC tier list video, we did talk about Texas head coach Steve Sarkisian. I said Texas is officially back. I told you to knock on wood. So it's not my fault if they just have a disaster of a season. It is yours because you did not knock on wood. But other than that, I still believe Steve Sarkisian has done a masterful job at Texas. He's really turned it around, and it feels like for good this time. In 2023, they went 12-2, 9-1 in the conference. They were the Big 12 champion, and they made the playoff, inevitably losing to Washington, but great season nonetheless. And they will, of course, make the leap into the SEC in 2024. Now, if you want to hear my in-depth dive of Steve Sarkisian, be sure to tune into that SEC tier list video we posted last week, where I go in depth about all the SEC coaches, except one. I did get a comment. I forgot Hugh Freeze, so I will include Hugh Freeze in next week's tier list video. Stay tuned on the channel to see what conference we're doing next. But whatever conference it is, Hugh Freeze will be included. I feel bad for forgetting him. Auburn fans, please don't hate me. Just tune in to the next episode and you'll find out where he's at. But regardless of that, the players returning for Texas are going to be quarterback Quinn Ewers, who has been there for, it feels like, 10 years now. He went 69% with 3,400 yards, 22 touchdowns, and 6 interceptions in 2023. At Texas, they got Arch Manning waiting in the wings. They're praying he doesn't transfer out. But in 2024, Quinn Ewers is their guy. Center Jake Majors is going to be a fifth-year senior. He started in 41 games in his career at Texas, and he started in all 14 games last year. He should be the anchor of that offensive line. And he was a Big 12 honorable mention last year. And left tackle Kelvin Banks also started in all 14 games last year for Texas. And he was a second-team All-American, could have been drafted, chose to stay at Texas. And he's going to hold it down on that left side of the offensive line. He's going to give Quinn Ewers a lot of protection, something that will prove to be very vital for the Longhorns this season. Their key additions are former Alabama wide receiver Isaiah Bond, who last year had 48 receptions for almost 700 yards and 4 touchdowns, with 13.9 yards per reception at Alabama. Isaiah Bond, just a freak of nature, great wide receiver. Other than Caleb Downs, might be the biggest loss for Alabama. He was easily going to be their wide receiver number 1 this year, but he transfers to Texas. Should be either wide receiver number 1 or wide receiver number 2 this year for them. Like I said, extremely talented. And also from Alabama, they bring in tight end Amari Niblack, who in 2023 had 20 receptions for 327 yards and 4 touchdowns with a 16.4 yard per reception. Black was a very reliable tight end for Alabama last year. Obviously, those stats don't jump off the paper, but if you watched Alabama football last year, like I did, he was able to find the gaps in the defense, and he was very hard to guard at the tight end position. Rarely are you matching up a cornerback with a tight end, and linebackers couldn't really guard him. And no shade to Jalen Milroe, should be able to make an instant impact due to the fact that Quinn Ewers is a much more accurate passer, and he's also a pretty good run blocker. So it's safe to say he'll probably make an instant impact at Texas. And third is defensive back Andrew Mukuba from Clemson. In 2023, he recorded 42 total tackles, 1 fumble recovery, and 6 pass defenses. Now, this, in my opinion, is their biggest addition of the 3. Mukuba was very solid at Clemson, and Texas's secondary was easily its weakest point last year. So adding a guy like Andrew Mukuba to strengthen that secondary. Now for key losses, we only had 3 players that we highlighted. Those players were wide receiver Xavier Worthy, who went to the NFL. Last year, he had 75 receptions for over 1,000 yards, 5 touchdowns, and 13.5 yards per reception. Wide receiver A.D. Mitchell, who had 55 receptions for 845 yards and 11 touchdowns. He was more of the red zone threat for them with 15.4 yards per reception. And defensive lineman Byron Murphy, who had 29 total tackles, 5 sacks, 2 pass defenses, and 1 forced fumble. Now, other than that, they also lost guys in Jonathan Brooks and Tavondre Sweat, who we did not choose to highlight. But those guys also made big impacts, and it hurts to lose, but based on their additions, they have rebolstered that wide receiver room, and they've got a lot of depth at defensive line. They shouldn't miss too much of a step there. The keys for success for the Texas Longhorns are going to be making sure they maintain a dynamic run game. Now, they lost their lead running back, Jonathan Brooks, last year. He had over 1,000 yards. But behind him, running back C.J. Baxter and Jaden Blue combined for over 1,000 yards and 8 touchdowns last year. So with more volume added to those guys, they should easily be able to replace those numbers. And the second key for success is going to be improvement in the secondary. We talked about Andrew Mukuba, how important he is for that secondary, because the defensive line was the focal point for that defense last year, to put it nicely. The secondary allowed 254 passing yards per game, which was 105th in the FBS, just not good at all. That secondary showed flashes of what they were able to do, but they were not able to maintain that consistently. Just really were not a good unit overall. And additions like Mukuba and a few others should drastically improve that unit, especially its depth, which seemed to be an issue last year. And overall should be a better unit. It would be hard to get much worse, but with an off-season of rejuvenation and development, they should be massively improved next year. Now for the schedule, it's actually decently lenient, or I guess as lenient as a new age SEC schedule can get. At home, they play Colorado State, UTSA, Louisiana Monroe, Mississippi State, Georgia, Florida, and Kentucky. Now, if you have ears, they just perked at Georgia. They do play Georgia in the 2024 season, but if Georgia's going to be on their schedule, you want to play them at home, and in 2024 they do. As for the away schedule, they play Michigan in week 2. They play Oklahoma at a neutral site, which is the Cotton Bowl. It's going to be the Red River rivalry as per usual. Vanderbilt, Arkansas, and Texas A&M. So not that bad. Michigan could be on a downslope this year. We'll have to wait and see how good Oklahoma is, but that is a neutral site game either way. Vandy, Arkansas, Texas A&M. If I was a betting man, I would say they go 3-0 in those games. Texas A&M is obviously massively talented, but in year 1 under Elko, they're probably not going to be at Texas's level. So an overall decently favorable schedule, like I said. Obviously, Georgia and Michigan are the 2 biggest names there. Don't forget Oklahoma. Oklahoma's going to be good. Never count on Oklahoma. They actually beat Texas last year. So those 3 games should be highlighted at Texas. But other than that, not a bad schedule at all. And for the final grades and the outlook for next year, the offense is going to come in at a 97, a high A ton of talent on that offense, especially the line, especially the running back room. The quarterback play has been consistent under Ewers, and that wide receiver room is getting rebolstered. If it was last year's wide receiver room with everything else, I'd probably give them a 99. But I feel like that slight downgrade from weapons, the loss of Jonathan Brooks, the loss of A.D. Mitchell, the loss of Xavier Worthy is what sets them back from a 99. But a 97 is still amazing either way. And the defense is going to come in at a 92. They obviously lost a lot of guys to the NFL on that defensive line. The linebacker room should be stable, and that defensive line should be able to maintain its dominance. They have a ton of talent on the line. The only thing that's holding them back from a higher grade is that secondary. Obviously, they had some great additions, but I'm still hesitant to give my full trust to the secondary. We'll have to wait and see on that. And for that, they got a 92 on defense. Now, for coaching, they're going to get a 98. They've stayed consistent since 2021. I don't believe they've had any coordinator turnover since then. Obviously, Steve Sarkisian has stayed there, and they've proven they can win championships. They won the Big 12 championship. They made the playoff, and with the amount of talent they have, it should be pretty safe to say they're going to stay in that picture, probably going to make the playoffs again this year, if I had to guess. And as for strength of schedule, any schedule with Georgia on it, especially combined with Michigan and Oklahoma, is going to get a high grade. The only thing that would have probably made it higher than a 97, which is what it is if most of those games were on the road. We will see later in the season previews with other teams. Terrible, not favorable away schedules there. But this is a Texas season preview, and Texas is getting a 97 in terms of strength of schedule. Overall, that's going to round them out to a 96, a high A. Like I said, Texas should be one of the best teams in the SEC. Uber talented. As for their ceiling, they could go 12-0 with an 8-0 conference record. Not super likely, seeing as they do still play some juggernauts in the SEC. And their floor is 10-2. I really don't see them dropping more than one game, probably to Georgia, and then maybe to a Michigan or an Oklahoma. I could see the jump to the SEC proving to be a lot more strenuous than originally expected, or that I expect. They could end up scrambling later in the season, drop a couple games that they could have won, maybe stoop below that floor, but I don't think they're going to lose more than 2 games. That would be a real disaster scenario for them. Somebody would have to get injured, and they would just have to flounder late in the season for that to be an expectation for me. And that's going to do it for this episode of the O&O Show. If you enjoyed it, be sure to hit the like and subscribe button. Be sure to tune in next Monday for our next tier list video, and tune in the Monday after that for the next episode of the O&O Show. We're going to be dropping hints as to what will be in that episode on our Twitter. Go ahead and follow us at O&O Sports. And with that, we will see you next week.